All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Winter Tree ID webinar. My name is Patrick Ma, and I just want to thank you all for taking some time out of your day to join this Tree ID webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We've placed all of you on mute, so if you have a question throughout the webinar, just go ahead and put it in the chat box. You can access the chat at the bottom of your screen. And then in the top right corner, please click on speaker view so that you can see Don Hagan's face and my face as well. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Throughout this webinar, we're going to be using a poll feature. So we want you all to be comfortable and familiar with using that poll feature. So we're going to get started with a quick poll. Where are you joining us from? And so go ahead and enter your answer. Oh, wow. Look at that. Oh, we got some out-of-state folks. And just so you're comfortable with the chat feature, if you're zooming in from out of state, go ahead and drop in the chat box what state you're coming from. Awesome. Very cool. Tennessee, Georgia, Ontario. Wow. Different country. North Florida. Awesome. Well, thank you all for indulging me with that quick poll. So thank you for joining us. I know we had a couple of Facebook advertisements for this webinar. If you're not already familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we're a leading conservation organization working in all 50 states and more than 70 countries to protect important lands and waters for nature and people. TNC has been part of South Carolina's conservation tradition for more than 50 years, since its first project in 1969 established in Bidler Forest Sanctuary. Since then, TNC has protected nearly 400,000 acres across the state. In addition to land protection, the South Carolina chapter has programs in freshwater conservation, forest restoration, and coastal resilience, as well as in Atlantic fisheries management. Just allow me to introduce myself. My name is Patrick Ma. I'm the Forest Conservation Coordinator for the South Carolina chapter. And today we have an awesome program for you. We're going to be talking about all things trees, what they are, why they lose their leaves, and then we're going to dive into a short PowerPoint presentation on how to recognize unique twig characteristics. You know, we're in the middle of winter here in South Carolina, and a lot of the trees don't have their leaves. Being able to identify trees just based on their twig characteristics is a fascinating way to learn trees. And then once we've learned these twig characteristics, we're going to use them to identify some trees commonly found in South Carolina. And we're going to do this in a pretty fun way. When you're learning dendrology if you're taking a college course in dendrology, one of the things that you learn when you're learning these trees is some kind of cultural or historical fact about each tree. So we'll test your historical and cultural knowledge of trees by posing several what we call trivia questions. And these questions are once you've had a chance to answer these using the poll feature, the correct answer will be the tree that we identify and describe those twig characteristics. But before we go into that, I want to take a moment to introduce our guest speaker today, is Dr. Don Hagan. So Don Hagan is a forest ecologist at Clemson University, where he teaches courses in dendrology, forest ecology, and forest communities, among others. The bulk of his research program focuses on fire ecology, addressing topics of management interests such as prescribed fire seasonality, the long-term effects of repeated fuel reduction treatments, and the aftermath of the 2016 Southern Appalachian wildfires. He works closely with the Nature Conservancy on many of these projects, and his book, Winter Tree Identification for the Southern Appalachian and Piedmont, a photographic guide, was published in 2019. So he's literally written the book on what we're going to be talking about today. Don lives in Clemson, South Carolina, with his wife Thea, who is a restoration ecologist, and their 2 children. And I just wanted to also pause and take a moment and make the Clemson Nature Conservancy connection. You know, Don and I had the pleasure of working with Don as a master's student in Clemson University, where I was his teaching assistant for dendrology. That took place right around 2012, 2013. And though I'm no longer his teaching assistant, we still work pretty closely today. Don actually helps us out on making management decisions, and that touches down in our Sandy Island Preserve in Georgetown. Through statistical analysis, Don and his students have been helping me and my supervisor and our staff make the best informed science-based decision for our controlled burning of the longleaf pine forest on Sandy Island. So that's just a little aside. So welcome, Don, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Patrick.
So Don, before we get started with just identifying trees based on their twig characteristics, maybe we should talk a little bit about dendrology, where tree identification comes from. Could you give us a little description on what dendrology is?
Sure. So dendrology is the study of woody plants, and more specifically, it's sort of the subdiscipline of botany and forestry that includes aspects of taxonomy, which is just classification, nomenclature, which is the naming of organisms, biology, ecology, habitats, and geographic range. So it's really all about plant ID, but it's more than just learning to recognize what a tree looks like, but also recognizing its role in the landscape, in those ecosystems where you find it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not just trees, shrubs, and woody vines.
Okay, so you make a really good point there in distinction between trees, shrubs, and vines. I know that most of the people joining us today and have in their mind's eye what a tree or a shrub or a vine looks like, but you know, is there like a textbook definition of what a tree is versus what a shrub is?
Yes, there is. So a tree is going to be, and you might see a couple of different definitions out there, but they're all going to be something like this. So a tree is a woody plant that's going to typically be more than 20 feet tall at maturity, usually with a single stem and a well-defined crown. Whereas a shrub is typically going to be less than 20 feet tall at maturity, oftentimes has multiple stems, and the crown is usually less well defined. Now, obviously, there's going to be some gray area in there. You might see some larger woody plants that have multiple stems, and some smaller ones that have a single stem. But sort of as a rule of thumb, that's how we use it. It's all based on size and the number of stems.
Okay. And how long have you been teaching dendrology at Clemson now?
I've been teaching dendrology since 2012. So the year that you TA'd it, Patrick, was the first year you TA'd it was my first year teaching it. So 3 sections, 3 classes a year for the last 9 years. I've taught it 27 times.
Wow. Yeah. And the reason I asked you that is that we have this awesome picture. If y'all aren't familiar with Devil's Courthouse, it's in the Pisgah National Forest, if I'm not mistaken, Don. And
that's correct. Yep.
Yeah, and it's this awesome overlook that's right along the is it the Blue Ridge Highway that's right there? And here's a picture that I was able to unearth here from back in 2012, and I don't know if you can see in the bottom left, just where the picture is starting to fade. There's Don in the bottom left corner there, and to his left that's me right there. So this is I don't know. I feel like this webinar is a long time coming. So anyway.
Definitely a throwback Thursday for sure.
Yeah, a little yeah, I love it. All right. So for those of you those of you zooming in today, you might recognize Don either by his name or by his face, because he has a special role in the Southern Appalachians, and typically right around I don't know, around October, he'll give a fall foliage outlook on what the leaf color might look like in the Southern Appalachians. It's a huge leaf peeper destination, you know, come that time of year. And I guess that's a pretty good, interesting segue into our topic today about fall foliage and trees losing their leaves. Don, might you be able to, you know, sum up what causes that phenomena?
Sure. So there's going to be two broad categories of trees that we're talking about. You've got your evergreen trees and you've got your deciduous trees. And those evergreen trees are going to be those that keep green leaves throughout the year, right? The leaves last more than a single year, so you've always got green leaves on an evergreen, regardless of what time of year it is. Your deciduous trees are going to be those that produce leaves that last less than a year, right? So the buds will break dormancy in the spring. The leaves will emerge. They'll do their best work throughout the growing season, and then as you transition into the fall, those leaves, you know, they've been tattered by the wind, they've been nibbled by insects, and there's various environmental cues, temperature, moisture, day length, etc., that ultimately sort of tell that deciduous plant that, hey, it's time to go ahead and drop your leaves. It's sort of a cost-benefit analysis that goes on within the tree. You know, there's a cost associated with maintaining those leaves. But as you get later into the year, as you start transitioning into the fall, the benefit that the tree gains by keeping the leaf on does not offset those costs. So that sets into motion this process of the leaf falling off, which first starts out with it, you know, it stops maintaining its chlorophyll, so it loses the green color, and these other colors emerge.
Awesome.
So there's some interesting biology that kind of behind the scenes of fall color every year.
Yeah, I remember in dendrology, there's kind of what starts the process is the change in the photo period, or like how many daylight hours, and that can trigger that loss in chlorophyll. Or
for many species, yeah, day length really is the sort of the driving factor. But for a lot of species, it's a combination of different factors that ultimately.
Okay. Well, I think that's a pretty good transition. So once the trees lose their leaves, once these trees lose their leaves, then it's up to us to try to identify them. If you're a tree enthusiast like us, to identify these trees just based on their other characteristics, not their leaf shape, but their twig characteristics, sometimes their bark. So why don't we talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. So like I mentioned, you know, I've been teaching dendrology since 2012, and you know, dendrology is a challenging course, largely because in our region, you know, in the Southeast, and in particular, you know, South Carolina and the upstate of South Carolina is really a biodiversity hotspot. We've got this amazing diversity of trees, and it's challenging to take dendrology just because you have to learn so many. We teach about 150 of them every year. And intuitively, it seems like it would be more challenging in the winter after the sort of the most readily observable feature of that tree, the leaf, has fallen off. And I've always told the students that that winter tree ID is actually not that hard. When you focus on the leaf can actually be kind of confusing. And here's just an example, right here. This is one of our most common deciduous tree species that we have here. This is red maple. And red maple has this tremendous variability in the size and shapes of its leaves. So if you're just focusing on the leaf, it can get a little confusing. Both of these leaves came off of the same species. However, twigs in particular, after those leaves fall off, the twig can be very reliable for winter tree identification because you're not going to see that level of variability. Every species is going to have every deciduous species is going to have a twig that has 1, 2, or 3 really key features that you can hone in on that aren't going to vary so much from individual to individual. So winter tree ID is mostly about twigs, focusing on some of those reliable features. While they are very small, you've got to kind of train yourself to look at something that might just be a millimeter or 2 across. If you can train yourself to do that, winter tree ID is actually not that difficult.
Okay.
So do you want me to go into sort of the steps of winter tree ID, Patrick?
Yeah, I think we'd love that. Yeah.
Sure. So winter tree ID, just like tree ID, any other time of the year is largely a process of elimination, right? When you're trying to figure out what a tree is, the first step is to try to quickly eliminate what it isn't, right? So we go through sort of a process of elimination, and that process is mainly focusing on twig characteristics. And what a twig is just the current year's growth of a stem or a branch. And so I've got a diagram of a twig here on the left. Some features that you want to focus in here on this twig would be the buds. All right, you've got terminal buds, which are usually the larger buds, and you've got lateral buds. So we look at the buds. There's also leaf scars, right? So if you look here, it's supposed to be an arrow. So if you look here, right, there's a leaf scar. There's another leaf scar there. So that leaf scar is just the scar that's left behind after the leaf falls off. And so you look at the leaf scars, and particularly you pay attention to how many leaf scars there are at each node. That node is just the point of attachment where that leaf used to be. And then you look at the bud scales and you focus on some bud scale characteristics that we'll talk about. And oftentimes, just with those first two things, looking at the leaf scars, trying to figure out how many leaf scars you have per node, and then looking at the bud scales and looking at those bud scale characteristics, just with those two questions, you can oftentimes narrow a tree down to a single species. For some species, though, it gets a little more complicated. You've got to focus on other characteristics, like the presence or absence of hair on the twig, or sometimes you have to look at non-twig characteristics. Maybe you can find some fruits on the ground. You can look at bark and things like that. So those are the sorts of things that we'll be focusing on today. Leaf scar arrangement, again, I mentioned that was the first step. Every tree that we're going to look at is going to have either 3, 2, or 1 leaf scars per node. If you got 3 leaf scars per node like you have here on the left, that means you originally had 3 leaves per node. This one here in the middle has opposite, and that's called whorled, by the way. This one in the middle has opposite leaf scars. You've got 2 leaf scars per node. When you've got 2 leaf scars per node, you've also got 2 buds per node, so you can look for those buds. And then the biggest category is alternate, 1 leaf scar per node. Right, so first focus on the number of leaf scars that you have per node. And then you want to zoom in a little bit and look at those buds and particularly the bud scale characteristics. Right, so in the upper left, we have what we call imbricate bud scales. And those are going to be bud scales that overlap like scales on a fish or like shingles on a roof. Upper right, we've got valvate bud scales. Those are scales, you've just got 2 of them, and they come together like 2 praying hands or like a duck's bill. We do have a few species that have bud scales like you see in the lower left. That's what we call a cap-like bud scale, just a single bud scale that sits on top of the bud. And then you have what's called naked bud scales in the lower right, or naked buds, I should say. And those are buds that aren't protected by any scales at all. These buds are usually very soft and very delicate, almost feel like the tip of a paintbrush. So again, focus on the number of leaf scars per node, and then focus on the bud scales, and then you can further hone in on some additional characteristics. All right.
And then you had mentioned that, you know, looking at other characteristics of the tree. If I recall correctly, back in Dendro, we learned that those even those characteristics, like the bark, can vary between tree to tree, but they can vary on the tree as well.
That's very true, Patrick. And so when you're relying on some of those other characteristics, you've got to be careful because bark is going to vary from tree to tree. And it also is going to change as that tree grows, right? So most trees are going to have fairly smooth bark when they're young, and they get, you know, they might develop some sort of texture or some fissures and scales as they develop. So that's a sort of a disadvantage of relying on bark, is that it can be so variable. Whereas those twigs, whether it's a tiny little seedling or a 100-foot tall tree, those twig characteristics are going to be pretty uniform. Fruits can also be helpful, but you may or may not find them. And you might even be able to find some old leaves laying on the ground or maybe still attached to the tree, but that's not something you can really count on.
Yeah, that's always a slippery slope, because if you're just walking in the woods, that leaf could have come from anywhere, really.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. So those are the basics, and so what we've laid out for y'all. So we're going to transition into our trivia, and so I just want to take a moment to restate kind of how we've laid this out. So we've selected a handful of twigs for us to identify and learn the unique characteristics of today. But one of my favorite parts of taking dendrology in college was that when you learn trees, you not only learn their name, their genus and species, their specific epithet, or how to identify them, but you also learn some kind of culturally relevant or historically relevant fact about that tree. And that's usually one of my favorite parts about, that was my favorite part about dendrology, aside from spending 3 hours outside every day. So what we've done is that we've posed questions, a series of trivia questions about that cultural fact, and we've listed a multiple choice, and the correct answer to that multiple choice question, trivia question, will be the subject twig that we learn how to identify. Does that make sense to everyone? I know you can't say anything, but I hope that's a little bit clearer than what I said earlier. So without any further ado, let's just dive right in with trivia question number 1. So number 1 is, what tree, considered the redwoods of the East, once dominated the Appalachian forest but is now virtually gone? Okay, I think we got some tree experts in here. All right, and 95% of y'all nailed it. It is American chestnut. So let's dive right into how to identify American chestnut.
Yeah, so American chestnut. Sounds like a lot of y'all are fairly familiar with the story of American chestnut. It used to be very common, probably just as common, if not more common, than some of our, the common species we have today. American chestnut was devastated by something called the chestnut blight, which is a fungal disease that was accidentally introduced from Asia. And by the 1940s, American chestnut was virtually wiped out. I mean, it's still present. I don't want to say that it's not there anymore, but usually what you're going to find now, instead of these large giant American chestnuts, is these small little shrubby resprouts. And so it's kind of a tragic story, but unfortunately an all too common story. We see similar situations happening with introduced pests and diseases with a lot of our other species as well. But American chestnut, just going back to some of those twig characteristics, oftentimes pretty much all you have with American chestnut is a little twig, a little sprout coming out of an old dead stump. And what you're looking at here, and you should be able to see it pretty clearly, is we have an alternate leaf scar arrangement. So we have one leaf scar per node. We got one right there, and then another one down here. So one leaf scar arrangement. And this.
Oh, Don, I think you went on mute.
I don't know how that, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened. So you've got an alternate leaf scar arrangement. And if you were able to zoom in on those buds, you would see imbricate bud scales, right? That's really one of your bigger categories though. So you really have to kind of use some additional information here. This is a little slender twig, and it's hairless as well. If you're real lucky, you might find one that's big enough to produce fruits, but that's, you don't want to count on that. But the fruit would look like this. It's this large spiny burr about the size of, almost as big as a tennis ball, with a couple of seeds on the inside. Look almost like sea urchins. And then I've got a picture there on the right of the bark, and again, rarely do they get really big enough for bark to be a useful characteristic, but this one on the right was pretty decent size. It was about 5 inches in diameter, and you can see that bark starting to get some texture, some sort of flattened plates growing on it, developing on it. And it's usually around this size or before they get to this size where they will die due to the chestnut blight and then sprout back. So that's American chestnut.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and transition to our second trivia question. So the Buttonwood Agreement is the founding document of what is now the New York Stock Exchange. And you know, this Buttonwood Agreement was signed under the shade of this species by a different common name. All right, so I threw a little bit of a curveball out here, and it looks like most of you took the bait. And you know, the correct answer to this is actually American sycamore, or what we call buttonwood. So why don't we learn how to identify buttonwood?
All right, American sycamore. That's an interesting fact, Patrick, and it's actually something that I didn't even know until Patrick told me. American sycamore is one that's really easy to identify. One of probably the easier trees to identify in the winter because it has several unique features. Again, it's one that has an alternate leaf scar arrangement, but it's one of the few species that has a single cap-like bud scale. So here at the end of the twig, you can see that bud, that sort of cone-shaped looking bud. There's just a single cone-shaped or cap-like bud scale sitting on top. Another interesting thing about that twig is that leaf scar, you can kind of see it down here at this second bud, actually wraps all the way around the bud. So for most of the species that we're going to learn, the leaf scar sits below the bud or maybe partially wraps around it. But in the case of American sycamore, the leaf scar goes all the way around it. And that's because the leaf, or the petiole of that leaf, which is basically the little stem that attaches the leaf to the twig, is swollen at the base, and that bud during the growing season is actually housed within that petiole. You won't even see the bud until the leaf falls off. So you got that single cap-like bud scale, the scar that goes all the way around it, and then that nice zigzag twig. Really interesting fruit. They're about ping pong ball size. We don't have to get into the technical description of the fruit, but the fruit is comprised of multiple seeds aggregated into this ball. And as they mature, they will just disintegrate and release a bunch of those tiny little wind dispersed seeds. And you'll see those fruits persisting on the trees into the wintertime. After the leaves are gone, you'll just see them hanging down. And then of course you got the bark. The bark is very distinctive. When it's young, it's gonna have sort of a greenish colored smooth bark that starts to get a little flaky. It actually can photosynthesize through its bark. As it gets older, it gets much flakier, particularly there towards the bottom, and that's what you can see here towards the base of the tree. And then farther up the tree, it turns almost this pure white color. So from a distance, you can easily spot those American sycamores in the wintertime.
And if I could go back to the seed here, I believe, at least this is what I was taught, is how sycamore got its name, or common name, buttonwood, is that those seed capsules appear to look like buttons. I guess buttons
Okay.
back in the day.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Don. Let's go ahead and line up another trivia question. All right. So, notable for its long cigar-like fruits, the common name of this tree originated from the Muskogean languages. And just as a brief aside, just touching on American sycamore, these American sycamore is pretty ubiquitous across South Carolina. You can find this up in the upstate at one of our preserves. At Blue Wall, I know there's a beautiful sycamore up that way. You can also find them. They're really commonly planted as street trees because they can grow very fast. Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and all right. So sharing the poll results. All right. 73% of you nailed it with Southern Catalpa. So let's go into Southern Catalpa.
All right, Southern Catalpa, probably one of my favorite trees. Just such a neat species, and it's unique in a lot of ways. I got the twig there on the left. It's kind of hard to see from this angle, but this is one of the very few species that has a whorled leaf arrangement. It can have 3 leaf scars per node. So back, during the growing season when it has leaves, you'll see 3 big old heart-shaped leaves attached at every node on the tree. It's got these nice sort of circular bowl-shaped leaf scars right there. And if you rotate it around, you'd see 3 of them all the way around. You scratch and sniff this twig, it smells pretty much just like a skunk. It doesn't smell very good, but it's a very strong, distinctive smell. And I always stress with dendrology, try to evoke all of your senses. Don't just try to remember what it looks like. The more of your senses that you can evoke, feel it, smell it, look at it, right? Each one of those is a memory trigger that can help with ID. So you've got that unique twig with the whorled leaf scar arrangement. You've got those unique fruits. I've got here in the middle a picture of a Southern Catalpa fruit, which is called a capsule. And they can be up to like 18 inches long. They're going to split and release these little flattened wind and water dispersed seeds. You can see some seeds there in the middle. And you'll oftentimes see these capsules persisting on the tree on into the winter time. And then you've got that scaly sort of grayish brown bark that you can see there on the left. So that's the Southern Catalpa.
Yeah, and just a quick aside to our audience, if you're looking for places to go get out and hike around, Clemson Experimental Forest is an awesome place to find Southern Catalpa. But if you're down here in the Low Country, you could probably find one out on Santee Coastal or Washoe Reserve. And just as a brief aside on common names, they can be a tricky matter. I remember my mom, of all people, coming to me and asking me to identify this tree that someone up in Pennsylvania had called it a catawba tree. Just keep in mind that these common names can vary from where you are in the country. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, we're chugging right along here. Why don't we go ahead and get another trivia question up here? All right. So this one might be easy for a lot of you. The honey of which of these trees is highly prized for its rich taste and dark amber color? All right, so 58% of you got it right. It is sourwood. And why don't we go ahead and learn how to identify sourwood?
All right, so sourwood. Sourwood's a pretty easy one to identify. This is a species that's very common, particularly in the Piedmont and the lower elevation mountains. I got the twig there on the left. The twig is interesting because the buds and the leaf scars are very tiny. So you can see a bud and a leaf scar right there. It's very small, just looks like a little bump. But if you look, you can see they do have an alternate leaf scar arrangement. There's only one leaf scar, only one bud per node. The bud is really too small to really tell what the bud scale characteristics are. The twig is interesting though, and we don't focus on color too much because color can change throughout the year, throughout the winter. But sourwood twigs are usually sort of two-toned in color. As you transition from summer to fall, what you're going to see, and as those leaves are falling off, what you're going to see is a twig that's usually green on one side and kind of reddish on the other. A student told me one time the way he remembered it was Sour Patch Kids, the candy, right? Because you got green ones and you got red ones. You rotate it around, you see those two colors. But as you get later into the winter, it pretty much just turns like a dark red color, maybe darker red, almost maroon on one side, and then sort of bright red there on the other. So color can be a pretty good feature with sourwood. Got the fruits there in the middle. They're these little capsules. This guy's going to flower in the summertime, and those flowers are going to be white. And then they'll give rise to these fruits, which are these little brown capsules, which will persist either on the tree or you'll find them on the ground in the winter. And then it's got some distinctive bark. There's the bark there on the right. It has sort of this slate gray color to the bark with these sort of rectangular blocks with these deep fissures or furrows between them. And another good feature on sourwood gets a decent size, 70 or so feet tall, but it's never straight. You'll never see a straight sourwood. They're always twisted. They're always kind of irregular in their shape. Also, brilliant bright red fall color.
Yeah, we have some brilliant examples of sourwood at our 9 Times Preserve. You know, if you're going to visit the 9 Times Preserve and you go to the Trillium Trail, if you look uphill, you'll see these large sweeping trees, and your best bet is that's going to be sourwood. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and queue up trivia question 5. All right, so the wood of which of these trees is commonly used for aging spirits such as bourbon? I think we have a lot of bourbon fans in the audience today, because 92% of you got it right. It is white oak. So let's go ahead and learn how to identify white oak.
All right, so here is white oak. Yeah, so there's a lot of different species of oaks that we have here, and oaks can be some of the more challenging ones to identify in the wintertime. But we like to put oaks into 2 broad categories. So we have what we call the white oak group, which includes white oak as a species, and then we have what's called the red oak group. And that white oak group, including the species white oak, is unique in that their wood contains these intercellular structures called tyloses, which block the xylem. They're like little trapdoors that fall down and block the xylem, which is the water transmitting tissue that the tree has. And because they have tyloses, they can be used to make barrels, and the barrels won't leak. The tyloses will sort of seal off the little holes in the wood. So the white oak group has it, including white oak, but the red oak group doesn't. So if you're making barrels to age bourbon, make sure you're not using a red oak because it's gonna leak all over the place. So white oaks, what we're looking at here, actually this is true for all of your oaks. What you have is an alternate leaf scar arrangement. You can see 1 leaf scar per node right there. You've got imbricate buds. If you look closely at those bud scales, you see those bud scales overlap. And then your oaks are also going to have a cluster of buds usually here at the end. So pretty much all of your oaks are going to have a nice cluster of 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 of those imbricate buds right there at the end of the twig. Right? So if you see those characteristics, you know you're looking at an oak. You can at least narrow it down that far. To get beyond that, you oftentimes have to rely on other features. So with white oak, what I'm looking at here is a twig that has no hair on it whatsoever, right? There's gonna be no hair on the buds, and there's gonna be no hair on the twigs. That's gonna help you distinguish it from, say, a post oak or something like that, which does have hair on it. And then it has sort of this sort of silvery gray color to the twig and kind of a reddish brown color to the buds. Right? But oaks can be a little tricky. Oftentimes, again, you have to rely on some of those other features. If the oak that you're looking at is mature, you'll oftentimes see these fairly large, fairly spherical acorns on the ground. They're going to drop in the fall. And the unique thing about the white oak group, including the species, is that those acorns are going to germinate soon after they fall. So all of the white oak acorns that fell in late 2020 have already germinated. Red oak acorns, on the other hand, won't germinate until after winter. There's the bark there on the right. The bark is sort of a grayish color if you're looking at a mature specimen, and it tends to have sort of a flaky, scaly appearance especially as you go farther up the tree. This is a really common tree, one of our most common oaks that we have in South Carolina.
Yeah, this tree, this white oak, is all over our Blue Wall Preserve outside of Greenville, and then I mean you can find it in the Midlands at our Peachtree Rock Preserve. It grows pretty well in drier sites. So happy hunting. Don, I wanted to circle back to this white oak and red oak group. Can you throw out some other species that would fit into that white oak group versus that red oak group? So just to clarify for our audience.
Sure, yes. So in that white oak group, you're going to see white oak, of course. You'll also see post oak. And if you're down more towards the low country, you might see sand post oak, which is just basically a dwarf version of post oak. Down towards the low country, you might also see overcup oak, which is another white oak species that's also planted outside of the low country, commonly as a street tree. Let's see, what other white oaks do we have? Live oak is in the white oak group as well.
That is a big one down here, yeah.
Yeah, it's evergreen, but it's in the white oak group. Yeah. Contrast that with the red oaks. The red oak group includes southern red oak, scarlet oak, blackjack oak, black oak, and a few other species.
Okay. And just to reiterate, oaks can be pretty tricky to identify just going by bark alone. You have to kind of look at the sum of the tree. I remember learning back in dendro that the red oak group and the white oak group will often in the wild, they'll hybridize. So they'll, like a white oak will be pollinated by a red oak and produce like a hybrid that grows up to reach maturity. And then that hybrid can back cross with can pollinate like a white oak. And then you get these basically scions of trees that have characteristics of both the red oak group and the white oak group. So you have, I've seen that out, I've seen that out in the wild before, and they can throw you off. So
yeah, oaks tend to be very promiscuous.
And, yeah, that's a good way.
And those, a hybrid between a white oak and a red oak would be rare, although I believe it can happen. But hybridizations within those groups, like different white oaks can hybridize, different red oaks can hybridize, and it makes identification pretty tricky. But fortunately, a lot of your oaks, they're going to exist at different places on the landscape, so that hybridization would be, it would be difficult for them to hybridize. Plus, they flower at slightly different times.
Sure.
So while hybridization does happen, you can also find those pure genetic individuals as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have time for one more trivia question, so let's get that one out. All right. So the wood of this common Appalachian tree is used to make Louisville sluggers. All right, 83% of you got it right. It is white ash. So let's learn how to identify white ash.
All right, white ash right here. So white ash is going to be in that category of species that have an opposite leaf scar arrangement. So when it has leaves, you've got two leaves at each node. And when those leaves fall off, you've got two leaf scars. So you can see a leaf scar here. If you rotate it around, it's almost a perfectly circular twig in cross section. There'd be another leaf scar on the other side. With white ash, what we're looking at here in particular is the shape of that leaf scar. I'm just going to sort of trace it. Right. So white ash is going to have sort of a horseshoe shaped leaf scar, which would contrast with a green ash, which has more of a semicircular leaf scar. So with white ash, the bud kind of nestles down into the leaf scar. You can see it right there, the little bud right there. Whereas with a green ash, that bud's going to sit on top of that semicircular leaf scar. All right, so there's your twig, usually kind of an olive green color. It's going to produce a fruit, which is similar to what you're going to see in green ash, which is a samara. It's a winged fruit. You've got a single seed and a single little wing. The idea there is wind dispersion. And then you've got your bark there on the right. Almost a hickory-like bark. You have these sort of interlacing ridges that come together and go apart, come together and go apart. So yeah, that's your white ash. And you know, white ash, sort of like the American chestnut, and really all of your ashes, we're starting to see them impacted by another non-native agent, the emerald ash borer, which showed up in South Carolina in 2017. So we haven't seen major impacts on white ash yet, but certainly there's cause for concern.
Yeah, and just again, I've found these white ash growing, and sometimes there's a green ash as well, but you can find both of them at our Blue Wall Preserve. But also, I would recommend checking out the close to the water at our 9 Times Preserve to find both of these species. So
yeah, so your white ash is typically going to be found in slightly drier sites, so sort of up the hill a little bit, whereas the green ash is going to be found more, you know, in the wetter sites, maybe closer to the water.
Awesome. Well, Don, you know, we're kind of out of time for our trivia questions, so I'd like to thank you. Just as a reminder to our audience, you know, Don's book is called Winter Tree Identification for the Southern Appalachians and Piedmont: A Photographic Guide, and was published in 2019. And if you plug that name and title into any internet search engine, it'll pop right up. So happy hunting with the twigs. And then we've got some time here for questions and answers, for a little Q&A. And we've also got some questions that were submitted in advance. So I'm just going to go ahead and rattle these off to you, Don, if you're game.
Sure.
All right. So this one is, what is the best way to differentiate between different Carya species at a young age? So hickory species.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let me just, so yeah, so hickories can be kind of tricky sometimes. But if you look closely at these twigs, you'll see that the twigs are actually quite different. So here's 3 of our more common hickories. We've got mockernut hickory there on the left, pignut hickory in the middle, and bitternut hickory there on the right. And I've got fruits for mockernut and pignut. So mockernut hickory there on the left is going to have a very, very stout twig with a very light colored terminal bud. See that terminal bud? It's very light colored. And the terminal bud itself, and also right below the terminal bud on the twig, you're going to see some sort of coarse hairs on it. Contrast that with pignut hickory. Pignut hickory has a more slender twig. It's very dark colored with a sort of skinnier, pointier, and darker terminal bud that doesn't have any hair. And then you have your bitternut hickory there on the right, which can be fairly stout, but the buds are very different, right? So the bud on the bitternut hickory there at the end actually appears to be naked. It's technically not a naked bud, but it looks like a naked bud. It doesn't have really any obvious bud scales, and it's covered with this sort of orangish yellow fuzz that you'll see on the bud. The fruits are also different. Mockernut hickory is going to produce this very large nut. You can see the nut there. There's the inside of the nut right there. And then there's the entire fruit right here on the left. And mockernut hickory has a very, very thick husk on it. Contrast that with pignut hickory, which has a similar fruit, but it's going to be smaller, kind of pear-shaped. And then the nut has a much thinner husk, like you can just sort of peel the husk off with your fingernail. So those are some of your more common hickories. I think, you know, if you could train yourself to zoom in on particularly those twig characteristics, you should have no problem. And I think your question pertained to how to identify them when they're small. Mm-hmm. A good thing to keep in mind with hickories is because these fruits are so large, the fruit doesn't fall very far from the parent tree, right? So if you're seeing small ones, there's probably a big one very close by. You know, that fruit didn't blow in from far away. So look on the ground for the small one, and then look around within a very small radius, and you'll probably find the big one as well.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question that we had submitted was, I guess this this participant is interested in mostly winter identification of invasive species. You know, the winter time can be a really good time to get ahead on, if you have a forest and have invasive species on your land, it can be a good time to get ahead on treating them. But first, you got to be able to identify that. So,
yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, so 3 of the more common invasives that we have, and we've got a lot of invasives, don't get me wrong, but 3 of the more common ones are going to be like princess tree, tree of heaven, and mimosa. All right, so here's princess tree right here. And princess tree, that twig is actually going to look a lot like a southern catalpa twig, with the key difference being that it is opposite in its leaf scar arrangement, meaning it only has 2 leaf scars per node. Compare that with the catalpa, which has 3, right? So you got 2 leaf scars per node instead of 3. Princess tree is also a prolific fruit producer. That's one of the reasons why it's so invasive, is that it has such a high reproductive output, right? So you're almost always going to be able to find, if it's a mature tree at least, some fruits either on the ground or still on the tree. And the fruits look like this here in the middle. They're these little capsules. They're about the size and shape of a pecan, and they're going to split open and release all these little wind dispersed seeds. So you might see some of those on the tree or on the ground. And then on a large specimen, you can see the bark. As it gets some size to it, it starts to get sort of these interlacing ridges, sort of flattened interlacing ridges like you see there on the right. So princess tree is certainly a big problem really all around the Southeast. We see a lot of it in the Piedmont and mountains and maybe in the coastal plain as well. Tree of heaven, another one that seems to be an emerging threat here in South Carolina. I remember when we first started teaching dendrology, it was kind of hard to find a tree of heaven around Clemson, and now I can take you to 1,000 of them. I mean, they're all over the place. Tree of heaven has a very, very stout twig. It looks a lot like a black walnut twig. You've got a big sort of heart-shaped leaf scar. It also kind of looks at a glance sort of like a smooth sumac twig, and you're going to see it popping up in a lot of the same places where you see sumac. A good feature though, you can cut that twig and you're going to see that the middle of the twig, which is called the pith, it almost looks like it's filled with peanut butter, right? So none of the other species that look similar are going to have that peanut butter pith. It even kind of smells like peanut butter, which is interesting. So you can look for that. And then the bark is interesting. I got a picture of a bark from a mature specimen here. It has sort of this sort of splotchy appearance to it. When they get big, almost like a chainmail appearance. And when they're young, which is obviously the best time to try to find them and eradicate them, you know, before they are reproductive, the bark looks almost exactly like the skin of a cantaloupe. So a couple features to look for tree of heaven. And then mimosa, another one that's really common, really all over the state. Mimosa is going to fall into that category of alternate leaf scars. You got 1 leaf scar per node. Got a really dark colored, almost black or dark green twig that zigzags, particularly towards the end. The buds are really tiny. They sit right on top of this leaf scar that sort of has 3 lobes. Looks like a little fidget spinner, if you remember those things. You see that little fidget spinner leaf scar. You scratch and smell that twig, it's going to smell just like green beans. So that can help evoke some other senses there. You'll oftentimes see the fruits persisting into the winter after the leaves fall off. These little flattened sort of papery legume pods. And then there's that smooth gray bark. No matter how big the mimosa gets, that bark's going to stay smooth. And as it gets some size, if you step back and look at the tree, it's got this sort of short trunk and then this broad sort of umbrella shaped appearance to it. So all 3 of those species are ones that you're going to see popping up alongside roads, disturbed areas, and places like that.
Awesome. So one of the other questions that we got submitted into the chat was, I think harkens back to your discussion about why some trees lose their leaves. So this was, I guess, this person asked, why do beech trees keep their leaves on until they leaf out in the spring?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So that phenomenon, there's a couple names for that phenomenon, but we call that tardily deciduous. So it is deciduous. but it's going to hold. I'm looking at a beech tree out my window right now. It's covered up with those dead leaves. So it holds on to them through the winter, and then they fall off. And quite frankly, I don't know why they do that. And I had a discussion with some other, forest biologists and, botanists recently about that. And I don't think there's really consensus on why that happens. Just an interesting phenomenon.
One of the theories I've heard is that it waits so it can like suck all the energy out of that leaf that it's invested. But that was, I don't know, that's just a theory, but
and that is what's happening. When these trees, start to go dormant, they try to recapture as much of that stored energy as they can. I mean, that's true for all species. So when trees are losing their color and changing color in the fall, they're mobilizing some of the resources from those leaves and storing them back in other tissues so they can produce new leaves next year. I heard an interesting theory on that from somebody the other day. And I don't know if there's any validity to this or not, but deer love to eat American beech twigs and those buds. And somebody hypothesized that by retaining those leaves, it might be some sort of herbivory deterrent. Because certainly those dry, dead leaves probably don't taste very good. It kind of stops the deer from getting after the twigs and the buds.
Awesome. Hey, that's fascinating to think about. Yeah. Okay, so going through these other questions, we've got a little bit more time here. Someone had mentioned that they had heard that looking or examining the branch of a tree can be a good way to identify a tree. Would you mind speaking on that a little bit, on I guess, like branch habit?
Sure, and that's an excellent question. And actually, for that question, I want to go back to the white ash. Oops. Right. So, we talk a lot about leaf scar arrangements, right? But at each leaf scar, at each node, there's also a bud, and that bud is going to become a branch next year, right? That bud that that's right above that leaf scar is going to break dormancy in the spring and become a branch. There's also a bud on the underside. So oftentimes you don't have the luxury of having the twig in your hand, but you can step back and look into the tree, look up into the canopy, and if you see two new branches coming out of one spot on a tree, the exact same spot, that tells you that you probably had an opposite leaf scar arrangement, right? An opposite bud arrangement, because each bud becomes a new branch. So that can aid with identification by looking at just the pattern of the branching, right? So 2 buds per node, you're gonna have 2 branches per node, 3 buds per node, you're gonna have 3. Usually that's not sufficient to identify it all the way down to species, but it can at least help you narrow it down. So that's what comes to mind. I'm not sure if that's what they were looking for with that question, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. All right. So we had a question in the chat, and I think they were referring to the Bluffton area, but I think it applies to the entire species range. But is there more, or are there more than one variety of live oak? Or are there like different subspecies of live oak? And that's
so
kind of the question. Yeah.
That's a great question. So there are 2 species that I'm aware of, right? So there's the live oak, which is the large, majestic one that we're all familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And then particularly in drier sites or alongside dunes and places like that, right along the beach, you'll sometimes see sand live oak, which is just sort of like a dwarf version of live oak. Typically don't get very big.
Okay. And I think this question's for you, Don. Do you see chinkapin trees at all where you work?
Occasionally. So chinkapin is a close relative of the chestnut, the American chestnut.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the same genus and it looks very similar. I don't see them very often. Chinkapins are also impacted by the chestnut blight. They're very susceptible to it. And, I used to teach it in dendrology, but I think the last time I taught it was probably like in 2013 or so,
Mm-hmm.
because, mature specimens are increasingly difficult to find. So the ones we see are usually small little sprouts along the ground, maybe 2 or 3 feet tall.
Okay. Well, I think that's about all the time that we have for questions today. So thank you so much, Don, and thank you to our lovely audience for submitting those questions. Just as a reminder, you can go out and find Dr. Hagan's book, Winter Tree Identification for the Southern Appalachians and Piedmont, a photographic guide. If you tend to get stir crazy during this quarantine like I do, we have a variety, TNC has a variety of preserves all across the state. You can visit our website, nature.org/SC preserves to find a preserve that's close to you. And I just wanted to let you know that we have an awesome webinar. The topic is Sandy Island. So it's a preserve that Don has been helping us out with making management decisions on. And my supervisor, Tom Dooley, will be leading that webinar. So check back in February. I believe it's on the 17th at 1 p.m. And then before you go, please complete the exit poll. So thank you, everyone, and have an awesome day.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, Don, can you hit that last slide, please?
Sorry, I forgot to advance to the last slide.
Oh, no worries.